I suppose that it's better late than never. It was all the way back in August that we last worked on the Model A, and when we left off, we had just finished up control arms for the front end, both the uppers and the lowers. With the changes to the chassis finalized, we mocked everything up and confirmed it all cycles as it's supposed to. From there, we got the chassis painted up, and then began the steps required in order to mate this to the original chassis that we cut apart. All of this comes on the heels of wanting to make improvements to the truck, following a bit of a fender bender that cost us some control arms. By the end of the episode, we had everything plumb, square, and level. It took a lot of time given that we're not working on a chassis table, but proved that it is doable. We threw some tack welds down to lock everything into place, and then called it a night. And that's where we are now, underneath the chassis once again, laying welds to join the front and the rear end of this thing together in holy matrimony as one piece of steel. With everything burned in, we're going to turn our attention to the other projects this truck needs to get back on the road and into a new owner's hands. Another casualty we suffered in our accident was damage to one of the primaries on our driver's side header. It's going to require a complete rebuild of that primary, and the challenge is this set of headers is symmetric. Given that the exhaust is visible from the outside of the truck and it's a bit of a focal point, we're going to have to put extra effort towards making sure our new replacement primary matches the one on the other side of the Model A.
But equally important to fixing that primary is fixing the flange itself. Hopefully you guys are able to tell on camera that we've got at least an 1/8 inch gap here. When the tire hit the header itself, it tried to pry it off of the engine and it just warped the flange. I took it over to the machine shop next door. I asked them, guys, could we maybe resurface this flange to flatten it out? Could we deck it? Or could we heat it up and kind of work with it, flatten it back out somehow? And they said, dude, you're barking up the wrong tree. Just cut it off and put another one on. And that hurt to hear, but I know that it's the right answer. So I'm gonna rebuild the first dented primary. We'll make sure that it looks the way that I want it to, that it fits the way the old one did before it got dented. We'll match it with the other side. And then once it's in place, we'll cut the flange off, we'll put a new flange on, we'll fight with it to get everything lined back up, we'll weld it together and hope the whole thing goes back on the motor how it's supposed to.
And so step one of the process is to clamp the header down and cut the second primary free from the flange. The benefit to the way this header is built is that it isn't welded to the collector. We have it held together with springs, meaning once this primary is free from the flange, it should just pop out, making replacement at least somewhat straightforward. However, even though we're going to replace the flange, we still want to clean it up to a smooth surface. We want our replacement primary to mate nicely to it so it mates to the new flange equally well. In some sense, this will be like putting together a puzzle that doesn't want to be assembled. Through welding the new primary and the heat the old one has undergone, everything's going to try to move around on us and will resist trying to go into a specific place. But with some persuasion, I think we can get it done. For material, we're using Vibrant Performance 304 stainless steel with a 16 gauge wall thickness, which is perfect for headers like this. We're also using a few different centerline radius bends to get the shape correct. We want to match that old one as closely as possible, but to be clear, these headers were never truly identical side to side. We're just aiming for the ballpark. Now, there are a few tools out there that make this job a little bit easier, such as ICE engine blocks, but in our case, we're doing it the old-fashioned way. It's a process of trial and error. We'll be cutting tubes, fitting them up, and then modifying them as needed, making sure not to cheat any of the cuts so that it flows well and looks the part. It can be tricky to get a tube to go from point A to point B in the shape that you want while only using pre-existing bend radiuses. Simply put, it requires a lot of patience. But after enough time, you can finally get it to be exactly what you need, and in our case, we're finally ready to tack it all together. Now, I know some of you guys are probably wondering, what is with this over-the-top, twisty, crazy set of headers anyways? Why something like this versus anything else? And the answer is, well, it's for fun. Not only does it sound awesome, it's a focal point of this build, and it looks incredible. It's a nod to the GT40 bundle of snakes, but with some new flavor. With everything tacked together, we can see that the new primary on the left matches the one on the right, at least in almost every regard. The segments are slightly different, but the same is true for the rest of the primaries on each side. The shape is really close, and I'm happy enough to call this one good, so we'll hit it with Scotch-Brite and polish it up before welding. Now, it's useless details for most, but for the curious, I'm welding with a 3/32 2% lanthanated tungsten and 45 thousandths 308L stainless rod. I used a size 12 cup this time around, and it looks like I probably could have gone a little bit bigger for some better gas coverage, but overall, I'm happy with these welds, and with the part cooled down, we can finally reassemble it and see what the finished product looks like. Honestly, I think we nailed it. It looks like a perfect replacement for the pipe that was there before, and these are going to look great on the Model A, but we still have to replace that flange. I'll be honest in saying, I got into a groove once I cut the primaries free from the old flange, and I welded the entire thing off camera, but the end result is pretty good. By bolting the flange to the workbench during welding, we got no distortion, and that means we are finally ready to bolt it back onto the engine. Now yes, there is also that dent on the primary next to the one that we replaced. I see it too, but I have a plan on how to fix it in an upcoming episode. For now, we've got the major scars taken care of, and all that's left is to give the headers a good cleaning because there's still some rubber residue from the tires on them. There's also the cross pipe that goes underneath the chassis, but we're going to install that in the next episode after we make some changes to account for how we've changed the frame at the front of the truck. For now, we just need to get the headers installed and then clean them off because there's still a bit of rubber residue caked on them from when the tires made contact. I won't lie, even though headers aren't going to get the car rolling any faster, it feels pretty good to see such an important piece of this truck bolted back onto it. This is one killer piece of progress towards completion. Now we're turning our attention to the inside of the car, which I know some of you are thinking that's not going to get us any closer to driving this car, but there are still some important details I want to take care of given the fact that I do want to sell this thing. And yeah, that sucks. But I don't necessarily want it gone so much as I want the money so that I can pursue the next big project for the channel now that the Ferrari is complete. So let's get some details done. I fired up Fusion 360, and I'm designing a window crank handle for the manual windows inside of the Model A. At the same time, we're going to make new sliders for the windshield so that it can properly open and close, because I had to cut the original one when I chopped the top. Last but not least, I want to design some frame caps to go on the end of our frame rails so the chassis looks nice and finished once we're done. And then I turned to our friends at Send Cut Send, and I uploaded all of our drawings, selected our materials, the thickness, and our quantities. Now, if you guys want to make parts just like I'm doing, you can get 15% off of Send Cut Send by going to sendcutsend.com/stanceworks. I started using them as a real organic customer, and I am so thrilled to have them as a sponsor of the channel. I ordered a few different variants of window cranks, so once they arrived, I decided which one I wanted to use, and then I did a little bit of cleanup to our half-inch thick stainless square drives, and everything else was ready to weld right out of the box. Now I'm guessing that you guys can understand how these are supposed to go together, seeing that you've seen the CAD model, but one of the challenges I was trying to decide how to overcome is I need to weld this part to this part, and I want them to be square to each other. I want this to be centered on this hole, and I want the square to be kind of square to the part. Lots of squares here. How do I do that other than sitting here and measuring it and try to eyeball it and get really frustrated when it doesn't go according to plan? Well, I realized I drew the part in CAD, I could draw a jig in CAD, and realized I could just use the 3D printer and make this really simple little part. And all it's gonna do is just snap on to the end of the arm here. I kind of made it overlap, you can see. And it's just gonna center up our square piece. So I'll nest it in the jig. I left myself an open end so I can come in here and I can tack weld it. And all I'm gonna do is clamp it down to the table so that when I weld right here, it doesn't kind of warp the handle towards the door panel. That wouldn't be a good thing. But we can clamp it down,
And then we can just pull the jig off, we can weld the rest of it, and use this again on the second arm. I think it was a pretty crafty, simple solution, and only took 4 minutes to print.
So armed with a clamp and a 3D print, I got everything located where I wanted it and got to welding. Because there's going to be a lot of force on this part, I went with 3/16 thick material, so burning through it wasn't much of a risk, but wanted to make sure I had enough heat so that these welds don't break for the same reason.
All right, while we're knocking stuff out, next I want to make the end caps for the frame rails on the Model A. I got to make sure they're facing opposite directions instead of the same way like I did last time, because that will look really stupid, trust me. I want to weld these without any filler. We're going to run the TIG torch down the edge, or down the middle rather, do our best not to melt the edges, and I want to use no filler, so it's just a fuse weld, so it's really nice and flat so you don't see anything, and I don't have to go back and finish it all down. I'm not a big fan of grinding down welds. So let's be very delicate, try not to undercut on the face, and see how good we can make these look.
Now, fusing these parts together isn't the strongest way to do it, but given that it's purely decorative, I'm not worried about that part. I just want a perfectly flat weld so that once we attach it to the frame itself, it looks good. With our welding done, we can cross these off the list and move back to our window cranks because those are still in limbo. The next day, the knob, the hardware, and the bearing we used in Fusion 360 showed up from McMaster-Carr and allowed us to assemble this thing. And that gave me an excuse to finally use this cheap arbor press I scored off Craigslist a while back. If you guys know me, you know I'll take any excuse I can get to buy a tool. Now for pressing this bearing into place, I undersized the hole on the arm by about 2/1000ths of an inch. So kudos to Send Cut Send for getting the accuracy perfect, because this is a perfect fit. With everything assembled, of course, I want to go install it, but there's something else we have to do first, because I realized there is a hole in the leather of my door panel. So logically, the next step towards getting the Model A back on the road is to, of course, reupholster the interior. Now these original Model A door cards are something relatively close to cardboard, and they're wrapped with black vinyl, and then that is of course stapled and glued down. The vinyl itself is not original to 1931, but I believe these panels are old, if not original. By peeling the vinyl off and revealing the original backing, it's clear this stuff has been reupholstered several times over. But we're going to try our best just to match what was in there last. So I went to the local upholstery shop, and the man behind the counter pulled out some vinyl that was literally a perfect match. I bought a couple yards, a can of glue, and we're going to give this our best attempt at a rewrap. Now the condition of the backing panels themselves is far from good. They're wobbly, not really flat, they've got all sorts of bumps and distortion, but you can't replace these panels because they don't make them anymore. Although the rest of the car seems to be available from a catalog, these are not. So we're just going to rewrap them, throw them back in, and not worry about the subtle imperfections. The OGs of the channel might remember when we tackled the carpet in the Ferrari, and this is largely a similar skill set. Although the carpet isn't in the 244 anymore, I was really happy with how it turned out, and I think that skill set paid off because this is really similar, and I'm happy with how these turned out as well. That is, of course, given what I had to work with. These panels clip in around the perimeter using small metal springs. I don't know that Ford had a great design with it, but it's lasted nearly 100 years, so we'll call it good enough. It beats whatever BMW was doing in the 90s, considering my E36's door panels fall off every time I open the door. With the door panel installed, we can finally install those window cranks. Thankfully, they simply bolt on to the original provisions. I still need to do some work inside of the doors to get the windows to operate smoothly, but these cranks turned out wonderfully. They operate exactly as intended, and now I can finally roll the windows in the Model A up and down at my leisure. Just as important as rolling the side windows down is being able to open the front window, because the tiny cab of this truck can and will get hot. I showcased the original front window slider at the beginning of the video, and now we're going to install the one that we made. It's a simple bolt-in affair, and although I still need to source a hand knob so that this is adjustable without tools, it performs perfectly and matches the utility of the side windows, so now we've got airflow. Now to the back of the truck, because there's an issue we need to address, and that's that I left ethanol fuel in the fuel cell for 2 years. I promised myself I'd never do that again and that I would drain this and pickle it, but of course other projects got in the way, and now we're here. I think it's worth opening this thing up to check the insides and make sure there hasn't been too much corrosion of any kind. The only problem is there's about 5 gallons of E85 in this thing, and that is a fire hazard. As someone who's had a garage burn down to the ground before, I take these things seriously, so after a quick glance inside and realizing I don't want to just try to pour this stuff out, we're going to move it outside and drain it the right way. But just like the ArborPress, this is an excuse. I finally get to use my desktop power supply. We'll set it to 12 volts and 3 amps, and we can always crank it up if we want to overclock the pump. I have no doubts that somebody out there is going to tell me this is the most convoluted way possible to drain a fuel cell, and I'm not even going to disagree. But it's either this or watching me pour it into a bucket and then have no idea what to do with the fuel. If you're like me and you want a desktop power supply to drain your fuel tank or just to test parts and pieces on your workbench, I'll put a link to the one I bought in the description. With the hose shaking and cavitating, I knew the tank was more or less empty, so it's time to unhook everything and finally open this thing up.
Still a little bit of fuel in there, but the whole point of draining this was, one, to get old E85 out. E85 collects water, and we can't use this. It's way too old. It's been sitting in here for like 2 years. And I wanted to check the condition of the inside of this fuel cell. It's an ATL cell that is E85 rated. That's why I bought it, because I knew at some point I was going to let E85 sit in this thing without draining it or pickling it. And those of you with E85 experience know that's not really good for anything. It's corrosive, it eats stuff, plastic, you name it. But everything in here is E85 rated. I'm happy to say that the foam looks perfect. Our PTFE lines look great. The bladder itself is in perfect shape. I'm really content with the way it looks. I think we can just finish draining the rest of this, put fresh E85 in it, we'll seal it back up, we'll put it back in the truck, clean it up, and call this one done.
With that, we'll give the top a much needed cleanup and get everything bolted back together. Once all of the screws are in place, then we'll take time to notice that there's a tag on this thing that says we should be replacing this safety foam baffling every year. So, we ordered some up, and that's on the to-do list for the next one. But finally, we're on to the important stuff, starting with the steering. We need to weld this tab onto the frame as a steering rod support. Each segment of our steering shaft needs a heim joint to support it due to the number of segments present. And given how important the alignment is of these sections, I wanted to wait until everything was in place before we weld this bracket to the chassis. It's something that could have been added before paint, but if we got the position wrong, it would spell disaster. Given that all of these repairs are due to a failed steering component, I'm not taking any chances, so we're just adding it after the fact. I want it to be correct. With the welds cooled down, we're able to actually install the steering shafts and get everything marked for alignment. It will all have to come back apart in the next episode for drilling, but it's important to get it all set up so everything can be marked and indexed properly. For those that don't know, every D-shaft has a pair of set screws on each end. Once we mark where those set screws need to be, we'll pull the D-shaft and we're going to drill a dimple into each one. This is so that the set screw actually has a place to go into, as opposed to just clamping the surface. On top of all this, I might even add a tack weld onto each shaft just to make sure that it can't come undone. It might be excessive, but I don't want that to happen to me or anyone else ever again. Ignoring the bolt that's in place of one of the set screws and the fact that it's hitting the AN fitting, turning this thing through its range looks like it's all working perfectly. That means we need to go to the end of the steering system, our tie rods. Some of you guys noticed that one of our tie rods was bent at the end of the last episode, so we need to pull these off and make a pair of new ones. Thankfully, these are made from a pair of cheap Coleman Racing tie rods, so making new ones isn't a big deal. We'll just take some 12-inch off-the-shelf ones and shorten them down to the proper length. Since they're hollow all the way through, all that we'll need to do is re-tap the inside. Because I want a nice fit and finish, we'll face the ends in the lathe before running a tap down the center. If I knew what I was doing, I'd tap them in the lathe as well, but instead, we'll take it over to the bench vise, clamp it down, and run a tap in by hand. Thankfully, I've got a left-hand 5/8 tap due to how many control arms we've made, so within a handful of minutes, we've got a finished pair of tie rods ready to go on. However, there is one problem, and that's that I'm not a bright man. I make mistakes pretty often, and this one was that I clamped this end of this piece in the vise to drill and tap this end, and I don't know if you can see it on camera, but it made the end of this oblong ever so slightly, and now nothing will thread into it. I tried straightening it back out. I tried retapping the threads. Nothing's really working. I don't want to spend more time on this. These were only $10. We could just replace them, but I've actually got some parts here, and I want this project done today so we can actually roll this thing around in this episode instead of waiting till next week. So let's just make some new ones. Instead of a control arm saga, it's a tie rod saga. But given the parts that I have on hand, these will be made from steel. It doesn't mean there'll be a permanent solution, but as said, I just want to get this thing on the ground and finished for this episode. Steel tie rods versus aluminum tie rods won't really make a big difference on this project, so in the end, what does it matter? I've got a bunch of leftover right-hand and left-hand thread tube bungs, so we'll just cut some DOM tubing down to the right length and weld them into each end. They won't have any flats for actual adjustment, but I have a feeling they should be turnable by hand, so we're just going to go for it. Fearing that I might damage the threads by having too much weld penetration, I decided to sacrifice a pair of worn-out Heim joints by inserting them into the part before welding. This means the internal threads will keep their shape no matter how much heat I throw into the part, and we won't have the same issue we just faced on the other tie rods. We'll throw a set of new 5/8 Heims in once all the welds cool down, and then it's time to fit these onto the Model A. With the tie rods installed and the steering complete, it's time to finally install our control arms. And that's perfectly timed because our control arms have returned from powder coating. After seeing the beautiful job they did on the Audi parts, I returned to Motorsport Powder Coating in Corona, California, and they did an equally impressive job on these. I went with satin black for a bit of an OEM finish, and because I don't really want these control arms to stand out. The guys at Motorsport Powder Coating took the time to block off all of the threads and mating surfaces, and the outcome is quite literally perfect. There's not a flaw on these things. Enough gawking over them, let's get them on the Model A. Thankfully, it's a bolt-on affair as always, and we mocked them up in the past so we know it all goes together without issue. First is the lower control arm, then the upper, and then last but not least, the spindle itself, which is held on by a factory ball joint at the bottom and a single 5/8 Heim joint at the top. We're going to need some shorter tie rod bolts, but these will do for the time being, because all I really want to do is just roll this thing around the shop. I don't want to be too sentimental, but it's been a long time coming wanting to see it this put together. All that's left are the coilovers. Our friends at H&R made us a custom set of coilovers for this project back before we debuted at SEMA 2018. As you can tell, these dampers are hardly bigger than what you'd find on a motorcycle. But because the motion ratio is a lot better than what we've got on the Ferrari, we've got a nice lightweight spring on this thing. Provides a ride quality that is really comfortable on the street. Despite how low this thing rides, it's still quite comfortable to be in, at least all things considered. I need to get fresh tires installed on our rotiforms, so for now, we're going to reinstall our old Motegi's. And for those that don't know, these are wheels off of a 2017 Riley DPI race car. You'll find this same set of wheels racing around the circuit at Le Mans. I had to have them when I came across them, and I think they're one of the coolest aspects of this truck. Along with all of the other oddities, it takes it from classic hot rod to more race-inspired, what on earth is that thing? With the wheels and tires installed, after 2 long years, it's finally time to set the Model A back down on the ground for the very first time. So it definitely needs an alignment, but man, does this thing look awesome back on all fours. Yeah, it's missing the nose and a bunch of other stuff, but I think within one more episode we should have this thing pretty close to finished and ready for the dyno. I feel kind of bad that it took us this long to get to this point, but I think that it's okay in retrospect when I look at what else we've accomplished. But I have been thinking, once this thing runs and drives again, am I going to be willing to sell it? Maybe not.
All right, moment of truth, I guess. It's a small car, but I wouldn't call it light. And it's like 2,200 pounds. I guess it's kind of light. Could be lighter. Not the easiest thing to push, but it rolls. First time on the ground in 2 whole years, more than 2 whole years. That feels pretty good. I'm excited. We're really close to starting it up. There's a handful of things we still need to do. We've got fuel cell foam here that we can go on and install. We're going to go through our fuel lines. We've got to finish up some stuff on the engine that's like real small, little knickknacks. I've got to build the whole front assembly, kind of the grill shell and all that, the frame that'll hold the water-to-air intercooler and the headlights. That got kind of a little bit bent up, and I want it to be right. But otherwise, man, it's coming together. I feel pretty good. I'm excited. The front suspension looks pretty good. There's one issue, and that's that I didn't account for some things when I changed the design of the suspension, and that's basically clearance to the front of the lower control arm. It hits under full lock, which kind of sucks. I want to try to figure out how I can get some more angle out of it. There's definitely ways to do it. One of them, of course, is just build more control arms. You guys know I love doing that, but I'd like to try to come up with something else if I can. I don't know. I got to spend some time thinking about it. It's going to take a little while, but otherwise, all the changes we made to the front look really good. I'm excited. It looks a lot better than it did. Overall, we're getting really close to getting to drive this thing. It's been a long time coming. Here I was saying, I think like, oh, we'll get it done in a couple weeks 2 years ago. So it's about time. But with that said, there's still a ton left to do. So hopefully we'll have this done for the next week, next episode. We'll have, at least it running and moving around under its own power with any luck. I don't know. We'll see, but I'll catch you guys then. We'll see how it goes.